Services and Care in School Settings. Segment 3, On the Ground, Head Start.
For generations, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian peoples have faced an ongoing crisis of violence, human trafficking, and an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people, also known as MMIP. In fact, Native Americans face a disproportionately high rate of violence. The lasting impact of this ongoing crisis can be felt across Indian country, urban areas, and beyond. More work must be done in order to build a safe and healthy tribal communities and keep our Indigenous people and communities whole. My name is Chance Rush, Executive Director of Our Native Men. I'm Hidatsa and enrolled with the 3 affiliated tribes on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Join us as we consider a path away from consistently repairing the damage that violence causes and start to consider how we, together, can begin the work on keeping us whole. During this podcast series, I will be your guide throughout the country as we speak to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island on how we can engage proactively to prevent MMIP. We'll speak with tribal leaders, community organizers, academic experts, and of course, our partners at the Administration for Native Americans, the Department of Health and Human Services, and other government agencies engaged in this work.
Episode 2, Protecting Our Children. Segment 1, Speaking Up for the Little Ones. This segment will focus on the implications of the legislation surrounding the Indian Child Welfare Act and the risk factors that Indigenous children contend with once in the foster care system, increasing their vulnerabilities of becoming a missing and murdered Indigenous person, MMIP. We will discuss the tireless work of advocates and why it is critical for continued awareness and legislation to safeguard our children and keep them within their culture and communities. Episode 2, Protecting Our Children. Segment 1, Speaking Up for the Little Ones. Mary Kathryn Nagle, Cherokee. Partner, Pipestem Law Firm, award-winning playwright.
Often imitated, never duplicated. Prepare to be motivated. Chance with greatness starts now.
Hey, how you guys doing out there? Chance Rush in the building. Chance with greatness. I have the privilege to partner up with ANA, Administrations for Native Americans, to bring to you a podcast series. This podcast series is called Keeping Us Whole, presented by the Administration for Native Americans and my nonprofit, Our Native Men. Today, we have a very special guest here with us. This young lady, she is a playwright. She's an attorney at law. She's a dog owner. She's a newlywed. She is sharp. She comes to us from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please let's welcome attorney Mary Kathryn Nagle. Round of applause. Hey, all right. Oh, man. Mary Kathryn, how are you doing?
Doing well, doing very well. Thanks so much for having me.
What's going on over there in, where you, Oklahoma, DC? What's going on over there?
DC. It's cold, it's windy, and work is busy. Everything in DC is crazy, but we have 2 cute little puppies, and so that's makes it all worthwhile.
Right. Now, a lot of us know who you are. I know you don't want to share a lot of your business, but man, what's the new life like? The new life, share with everybody the new life.
It's a blessing. It's hard to believe. Less than a year ago, was able to marry the love of my life, Jonadev Chowdhury, and I'm now a stepmom to 2 amazing stepsons. That's Kano, who's 14, and Hamati, who's 11. And they're in 6th grade and 9th grade, and we live here in Virginia where they go to school. And it's just been really a wonderful blessing to be able to be a stepmom too. So that's been a lot of fun. And then of course we got puppies, which is really crazy.
Yeah. Wow. I know they're all over the place, which is pretty cool. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, from the jump, I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of the stage play Sovereignty, and it tells the story of Cherokee Nation's battle for recognition and self-determination. Okay, just And in your words, what's your motivation to write this stage play? And you already are very busy as an advocate and a lawyer, but man, we're going to add being a writer to it. I mean, can your plate get even any more full? So go ahead and share with us about sovereignty. Where'd that all come from?
Well, it's a very personal story in terms of my grandfathers. John Ridge was my great, great, great grandfather, and Major Ridge was his father. And they were leaders in Cherokee Nation in the 1820s and 1830s. And I grew up sort of hearing the stories from my grandmother of what they fought for, what they sacrificed. And the reality is many Cherokees today still consider them to be traitors because they signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. And that treaty was a treaty in which Cherokee Nation agreed to sell lands in our homeland and move west into Indian Territory, where our reservation is today, and in fact has recently been affirmed as a reservation that remains in existence by the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. But at that time, Cherokee Nation was very divided. My grandfathers were not the elected leaders of Cherokee Nation at that time. Of course, John Ridge had sought to run for principal chief, and then Principal Chief John Ross had canceled the elections, declaring things to be a constitutional crisis following the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia and the failure of President Andrew Jackson to enforce it. And so it was a time of great turmoil for Cherokee Nation, and I think understandably, many Cherokees today are still very upset that my great, great, great grandfather signed this treaty, and other people too. I mean, there were hundreds of people in what we call the Treaty Party, which was a political party in Cherokee Nation, and there were hundreds of assassinations from 1839 to 1845, including my grandfather's. And so I think it's a story that resonates for a lot of tribes in Indian country, because all of our tribes faced that moment at some point of, do you stay here and fight to preserve your sovereignty in your homelands, or do you say we're going to preserve our sovereignty as a nation elsewhere with a better chance of survival, where we won't be attacked, for instance, by the state of Georgia in that instance? And I think it's a very tough decision for our leaders to make, the leaders that did make those decisions. And I felt inspired to share that story from my point of view as I understood it growing up, listening to my grandmother.
And I want to thank you just here publicly with everybody for the opportunity to be in that play, and I was inspired to go to it because I kept hearing about it. And I never thought, Mary Kathryn, I never thought, that I would ever have the opportunity to not only play in it, but to take on the lead role and be John Ridge. And I want you to know that at first I was excited about being in a stage play, and actually at that, your stage play, because I know that you also worked on, is it Sliver of the Full Moon? I always worked on that. Man, just phenomenal. You're a phenomenal writer. But then when I read the script, I really felt like I have a responsibility, that this just isn't, my time to start acting. Like, this is a huge responsibility. But not only when I read the script, I got emotional. I got emotional because there was no sellouts back then. There was no, we had no choice. Andrew Jackson held a gun, to Native youth, to a lot of people. And we had no way out, so I'm glad that you got to mention that. I'm glad that you got to bring that up. And just best of luck on more of your writing and more of your work. I'm excited to be able to listen, watch, hopefully be in another one or whatever. But I take the role very serious, and I know I got emotional a lot of times back. So I think one of the most emotional times was the opening night, and then the last night when we're like, man, we're not going to do this together again for a while, and that was very touching. Hey, listen, I know that you've got a lot going on here, ladies and gentlemen. I want to just again want to welcome Mary Kathryn Nagle. She's part of our 4-part series, Keeping Us Whole, presented by the Administration for Native Americans and our Native men. Today's segment is episode 2, segment 1, protecting our children. Mary Kathryn, you've done so much work focusing on children. Why is this a priority to you?
Well, I think a lot of us understand in Indian country that our children are the future of our tribal nations. Without children, we have no nation. We have no future citizens. We have no future language speakers, culture bearers, tribal leaders. You don't have a sovereign nation if you don't have your children. And that's also how our culture has been passed down generation to generation, is through the sharing of that knowledge and those traditions that our grandparents passed down to their grandchildren or parents to children. And so I think a lot of tribal leaders and advocates recognize that, in addition to loving our children so incredibly and deeply, that it is so critical, not just for the selfish reasons that we really love our children, but that for our nations to survive, we have to protect our children. And in fact,
Right.
I think the U.S. military understood that. That's why in massacres like Sand Creek, they slaughtered our children, right?
Yeah, they did. Yep.
There was a very specific effort to take our children from us. I mean, that's the entire purpose of the boarding schools, was to take our children and to tell them, you're not Cherokee anymore. You're not Cherokee. You're not Choctaw. You're not Lakota. You're not Chickasaw. You're not Mohegan. You're not Ojibwe. You're white, and be white and assimilate into this culture and stop being who you are, so that our nations would stop existing. And that effort failed, but it did cause significant trauma. And we're still fighting removal today, in terms of the attacks on the Indian Child Welfare Act. And even though we have federal safeguards in place to say, hey, when we have a Native family, a state can't just come in and break it up and take that child out and put it in a non-Indian family. You've got to protect the rights of the child, protect the rights of the parents. And if you're going to take a child out of a home, you should make all your efforts to first place that child with another member of their family in their tribal nation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good practice for any child, whether or not they're Native, right? Is to keep a child with his or her family. But even though we have those laws in place, there are a lot of courts who don't follow them, and a lot of advocates out there for the billion-dollar child adoption industry that seek to circumvent those laws and or obliterate them. And so our children are still being attacked from all sides. And then you also add in the fact that, there's a very high rate of non-Indian sexual assault against our children, whether it comes in the form of teachers in schools or boarding schools, or, you look at the Dollar General case, and that was a non-Indian Dollar General store manager sexually assaulting a Choctaw child on the Mississippi Choctaw Reservation. That case went to the Supreme Court in December of 2015. So there's a lot of work to be done to protect the inherent right of tribal nations to protect their children from those people who seek to harm them and or violently remove them from their own families and nations.
Man, I see a lot of passion in what you're sharing here, and through your legal work, how should our children be valued, and what needs to happen from the community perspective to protect them?
Well, I mean, our children are priceless, right? There is we can't place a dollar value on them. And but the American legal system requires us to. So when big fancy attorneys like Gibson Dunn start trying to take down the Indian Child Welfare Act, tribes have to step up and pay attorneys to fight for the rights that we've already won, that we've already secured, right? And that are inherent to our nations. And so we are in the middle of a giant battle to protect our children from those who seek to take them from us. There really hasn't been a moment in time since the United States came into creation in 1776 that outside non-Native American forces haven't been trying to take our children from us. That's been a consistent effort. I think what's alarming about right now is that we had started to make progress. If you look at the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, that was turning the tide, right? Like, it was a huge change from a federal policy before, which had been obliterate the Native family. That will secure the obliteration and eradication of tribal nations. And the Indian Child Welfare Act was a turn away from the colonial efforts to exterminate tribes, and it turned back towards, let's affirm the inherent right of tribal nations to protect their children, and to determine what's in their own children's best interests, just as the state of Kansas wants to determine what's in the best interest of children in the state of Kansas, right?
Mhm.
And what we're seeing now is an effort to undo that, which is incredibly well funded. And there's a high level of strategy and coordination across the United States from, I think, some not well-intentioned advocates
Mm.
who have other intentions too. For instance, the Koch brothers, who are funding this effort to obliterate the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we may say, well, what do the Koch brothers care about the Indian Child Welfare Act? Well, they have an ultimate goal to undermine tribal sovereignty that they see in their economic interests, and it really has nothing to do with
Right.
children. They
With
don't.
us.
Yes, and they see the Indian Child Welfare Act as something that if you can dismantle that, if you can get the United States Supreme Court to say that Congress can't legislate and use the word Indian to refer to a citizen of a federally recognized tribal nation that predates the United States, because that's unconstitutional somehow under the 14th Amendment, then you've overturned basically all of federal Indian law. And I think you really call into question, under a federal legal framework, how tribes continue to exercise jurisdiction and sovereignty over their own lands, because the entire federal legal framework today is premised on the identification of tribal citizens as Indians. So
Right.
we're really facing a moment here, where it's going to be all on the line, I think. And the other side's very well funded and thinking very strategically, and they're attacking our children.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they
Mhm.
intend to attack tribal sovereignty and much larger things, broader things, they're starting with an attack on our children.
You know, you're right about the economic interest of, of non-natives, and how, that's the priority to them, and that's always been the priority to a lot of economic interest.
Mhm.
Is that first, and then who we are, it seems to be second, which, like you said, it's attacking our children, it's attacking our people, it's attacking our women. Want to go over here, this podcast, we're talking about MMIP. One major drive of MMIP: missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Some say missing or murdered Indigenous persons. I know that Delight said that earlier in her podcast. But one major drive of MMIP is children running away from foster care or other placements. What have you seen work to prevent that from happening?
I think that we have to, first of all, it's really important to recognize that, because I think most non-Native Americans have this assumption that when a state foster care system takes a Native child out of a Native home and puts them in the state system, that's because that child is going to be safer in that foster home. And in many cases, they're not. Right. And there's a lot of corruption in how these homes are funded and the people who run them. And there's all too often really tragic scenarios happening where Native children are being sex trafficked out of these foster homes. Right. And so what do? Well, one, we've got to start working with our state, our sister agencies in the state government, to educate them on these issues, and to, because it's in the state foster homes, right? And so they're going to have to step up, recognize the corruption, recognize where the sex trafficking is happening, and we're going to have to get state courts to do a better job of enforcing the Indian Child Welfare Act, because right now a lot of state court judges ignore it.
Yeah.
And so how do we do that? Well, it can sound really daunting, but I think that wherever we can, we need our tribal court judges to engage in federal, state, tribal judges forums. And there are some examples of where this happens, like in Michigan, where tribal court judges will do conferences with federal and state court judges, and they'll sort of talk about the different cases they hear, the jurisdictional issues, how they all relate together. And I think in the states where that happens, state court judges, a lot of state court judges operate based off of prejudice, right? And we know the systemic erasure of Native people, the fact that, the reality of our sovereignty and our histories is like erased from curriculum. So, state court judges aren't learning about tribal sovereignty in law school. They probably don't even learn about the Indian Child Welfare Act in law school. And then they get to be a judge in a state court and they're like, what the heck is this? I'm not going to follow it. And if they can actually sit across the table from a tribal court judge and talk to them about, they start, those prejudicial barriers start to drop off and they realize, wow, this judge went to a law school just like I went to a law school. This judge is serving as a judge because he or she cares about the safety of his or her community, just like I do. And some of that prejudice starts to dissolve and you have a human connection. And we just need more human connections. And I think that will help too, because there are a lot of laws on the books right now that should prevent the sex trafficking that happens. They're just not being enforced. They're not being followed. And a lot of that is the result of state adoption agencies, state child welfare agencies, and state courts not following the law.
Right. My last question for you today is had to do with an example. After the play one night, we had questions and answers, and a lot of people brought up VAWA. I may be going off script here a little bit, but they brought up VAWA, and Candace did such a great job in like sharing that, expressing that. I mean, it was like as an actor, you got to memorize a whole page, but just you could tell she had that down and she wanted to read it. She wanted to say it, but that was just an example of, you brought attention to something that is clear and present that we need to see, VAWA, and you put that in a play, and it wasn't, there was no way around. Pay attention to what we're saying here. It wasn't part of the act. It was like a public announcement inside of a play. And I guess my last question to you is, what role does story play in keeping children safe, like VAWA did for how you brought awareness to our young ladies, our women, I mean, and what other resources do we have as Indigenous people? What other resources do we as Indigenous people have to protect our children?
This is a great question. And I think that, storytelling is really important. For one main reason, our stories have been erased historically. And I think that when we tell them, we're combating that erasure, we're educating people, and we're healing ourselves. And I think that with VAWA, part of the reason why it's such an incredible story is because the 2013 signing of VAWA is the first time in U.S. history when a U.S. president stood up and signed a law that actually restores tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction instead of taking it away, right? We think of like Andrew Jackson, and we think of Oliphant, and we think of all these Supreme Court decisions and federal actions, federal policies that took things away from our nations. And finally, in March of 2013, we had a U.S. president restoring something that had been taken away. It was very historic. I think, obviously for Native women who, we suffer the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual assault and homicide in the United States. So that had special meaning. But for all Native people, in part also because I think, traditionally we understand women are sacred and that there is a very sacred connection between safety for Native women and the sovereignty of our nations. But also just to be witness to this moment in history when our sovereignty is being restored and the safety of our women is being upheld. And that was a really significant moment. It's a very inspiring moment. I think it's inspiring many of us on the ground to keep fighting for more restoration and to not give up the hope that, at some point, our nation should be made whole. We're nations that predate the United States, and there's no reason for us to have less sovereignty than the states who came into existence after us and did, in some instances, shady things to make their existence possible. So, I think it's just a reminder of what we have to fight for.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Kathryn Nagle, Mary Kathryn Nagle, man, it's very seldom I do 2 rounds of applause, but we want to thank you for joining us today. And we're gonna keep you in our thoughts, our prayers as you continue to stay on the front line, and best of luck with the writing. Best of luck with advocating, and you're just you're an amazing person. Honestly,
Oh.
I know that we've known each other for some years, but literally you and Jonadev, you guys are like a talk show. You can go just hang out with y'all for a little bit, and you guys are just a talk show, and then like a small hearing will break out, or a small consultation over there will break out. I remember one time we were somewhere, and we were up, and we were all talking and visiting, and then man, Jonadev got caught up talking with somebody, and man, just I learned so much about the law just in conversating. So thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, again, this was episode 2, segment 1. We have Mary Kathryn Nagle here, still newlywed,
Yeah.
proud mom.
Mhm.
This program is being presented to us by the Administration for Native Americans, our MMIP, our preventing MMIP, keeping us whole. I'm Chance Rush. Mary Kathryn Nagle here is our guest. Please stick around as we have more of our podcasts. So thank you all. Thank you, Mary Kathryn, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Mary Kathryn. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having
All
me.
right.
It was an
All right. Hey, don't forget to join us. Okay. Thank you guys very much. We're going to get out of here, and you guys have a good day. I didn't mean to cut her off. Dang. Okay. All right. Have a good one. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Please visit the following websites to identify federal resources to assist communities in preventing MMIP. The Administration for Children and Families ACF MMNA Framework landing page. https://www.acf.hhs.gov/ANA/MMNA-framework. ACF's Family and Youth Services Bureau. Domestic Violence Resource Network. https://www.acf.hhs.gov/FYSB/FV-centers. The Administration for Native Americans Domestic Violence Awareness Public Service Announcements. https://www.acf.hhs.gov/ANA/domestic-violence-PSAs. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Violence Prevention Resource page. https://www.cdc.gov/violence prevention. U.S. Department of Interior's Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit. www.bia.gov/service/MMU. The U.S. Department of Justice MMIP landing page. www.justice.gov/tribal/MMIP. We would like to thank all the speakers for their time, support, and dedicated commitment to the MMIP podcast series. Through continued advocacy and collaboration, we can work together to end the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people, MMIP. The views and opinions of featured speakers on the MMIP podcast series are solely theirs and should not be attributed to the Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Children and Families, or the Administration for Native Americans.